On the agenda is a university project. So the minutes of the last meeting have been distributed. Are there any amendments to the minutes?
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of the minutes of January meeting. Second.
All right. A proposed agenda has been distributed, all members and to the public. Are there any amendments to the proposed agenda? Agenda is placed on the table for discussion. All right. First project, Indiana University, Dr. Tom Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Budget Committee. Tom Morrison with Indiana University. On behalf of the trustees of Indiana University, I bring before you two projects this morning. I appreciate the chairman and the committee's indulgence to review these projects in what I know is a very busy time for you. These two projects are critical and related for critical renovation needs on the Bloomington campus within our housing system. First one is the renovation, the full renovation of the McNutt and Foster residence hall complexes. These are both about 1,250 beds, so a total of 2,500 beds to be fully renovated during the coming academic year. These residence halls were built in the early 1960s of antiquated mechanical systems, and those systems will be fully replaced, as well as fire systems, roofs, windows, and restrooms and plumbing renovation, as you might expect. We had been on a plan. The university's housing system grew up very intensively in the 1960s as the university grew. And so we had a complete generation of housing stock that was all built at the same time. We were on a renovation plan that of these two, we were going to do over the course of about 6 years. Because of some failures in those mechanical systems that you may be aware, we're bringing that project forward to try to do in 2 years, and with the primary Foster McNutt renovations to take place over one academic year. Total square footage of the complexes together are over 550,000 square feet, 2,500 beds in over 9 buildings, and the project will be $56 million. It will be funded from housing and residence life revenues. I'd be happy to answer any questions on this one.
Questions for Dr. Morrison? Dr. Brown?
Thank you, Tom. Is there any bonding that's going away, or will this just be all increased living fees for students?
This will be bond. It is our intent to bond this project. There will be bonds that fall off over the next few years. In terms of its impact on housing fees, it is the case that and this is something that our trustees are very concerned about as well, is that we not have blips in our fees that deal with the capital project of the day. And so over time, this will have the same effect on fees that the system has regardless. So we would look for fees to track inflation as we project. We do not see a vast increase in fees because of the bonding on this project. And part of the ability we have also is to dip into reserves, and that's why we have reserves on the housing system.
Any other questions? Senator Taylor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tom, does this have anything, I think it might be in the next project, I just want to make sure, does this have anything to do with the issue that you had on campus there with the having to remove some students because of some problems in the rooms?
It does. So these two, you may have read or reported that these two residence halls had a mold outbreak back in the fall of this year, and we did move some students out of these complexes. In order for us to have the assurance that it wouldn't happen again, we felt it was prudent to try to renovate these all at one time, as opposed to doing it in pieces over the next 6 years.
Okay. Now, Briscoe Quad is renovated, right?
Briscoe's already been renovated, yes.
Right. So this would be for McNutt and Foster.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. How are you going to do this? Are you going to do a CMC at risk, or how are you going to?
We intend to do it as a CMC at risk.
Okay. And you're going to take advantage of that opportunity. Just to note, will be when you said about a year and a half for this.
A year. So
1 year.
that's why the timing is critical for this review today. It would be our intent to empty the buildings as soon as the academic year ends in a few weeks, and then start the project.
It's quite a few beds not to have for a year. What are you going to do with the students that are?
That would be the next item.
Okay.
All right, you want to go ahead and go over
Sure.
your next item then?
So the second item on your agenda is related to the first. This is the university seeking your approval to do temporary leases of housing off campus for the next academic year. We are taking offline, with the combination of the Foster McNutt renovations plus the existing Teeter renovation that had been previously approved, about 3,000 beds. In order to try to create some stability for our returning students, we are seeking to lease about 1,200 beds within the local market in 3 very large complexes, and so that students would have the opportunity to live in somewhat university housing-like arrangements in an apartment setting. The fees on those apartments have already been negotiated, average rates of about $750 a month, which compares to what our university apartment rates would be. The total cost to the university system would be $9.5 million, but that will be paid for by the students who occupy those units, and those are 100% reserved at this point, so we feel good about that. Be happy to answer any questions on this piece.
Questions for Dr. Morrison? Senator Taylor.
Thank you. What complexes are you going to be looking at?
It is our intent to utilize Smallwood, Park on Morton, and Reserve on Third, if you know anything about the Bloomington.
Parkwood?
Smallwood, Park on Morton, and Reserve on Third. And those are
Okay.
three of the largest complexes in Bloomington.
Right. Now, you're paying $750 a month rent. It doesn't sound like room and board, though. That doesn't
It is not board. It's just room.
just room. So the students will have to.
They can buy into a dining plan if they wish or not.
Okay, so
We've tried to provide flexibility for the students going into next year. And to give you an idea of how this affects the housing system, we've been asked the question, we can, with our remaining rooms on the campus, 100% accommodate the freshman class, and that's a priority for us.
Okay.
And then, so what this allows is those returning students who want to live on campus, which is not the majority. Many students move off campus when they get into their upper years, or move off campus. This will provide that opportunity for those that might have wanted to live on campus. So we're providing that environment for them.
okay, so you're going to create kind of a university housing.
Yes.
It's going to
And
be.
these will be one-year arrangements. And then it is our intent to have those 3,000 beds to be renovated back for the 2020-21 school year.
Okay. Last but not least, do you have a plan to achieve the goals that are set by the IDOA on this project?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think you'll find that Indiana University is one of the best performers in that regard. And I would also share that the CMC statute that you all passed a few years ago has helped us in that regard.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any motions to remove items from the agenda? I'll entertain a motion to formally adopt the agenda. Can we take that by consent? Consent. All right, thank you. Next, we're going to have Tom Jackson for our economic forecast.
Thank you. I'd like to provide an update on the economic forecast driving the revenue forecast for the state. I'll try not to make this a complete repeat of what we talked about in December, really focus a bit more on anything that's changed, any risks, but certainly just want to lay out the landscape as we see it. I mainly want to talk about the state of Indiana, but certainly need to preface comments with our expectations about the U.S. forecast. Really had a little better growth in 2018. Really expect a bit of a downward path to we're still talking about positive growth, but just at lower rates. Again, very much in line with what we've been expecting for some time. We really see long-term, kind of potential economic growth given the labor force, the expected labor force growth, productivity growth around 2%. So we can get away from that for a little while. We don't really see being able to get away from that for a long period of time. Some things have gone a little better, a little worse since December. I know in December there was a lot of concern about what was going on in the stock market, some pretty big declines that were causing some concerns for consumers and businesses. That really settled down as we got kind of through January. So that's certainly been a positive development over the last few months, and things have really steadied out on that. Consumer spending certainly been a big item. Good overall growth in just the economy. Kind of a couple of odd things that I'll go ahead and well, I don't know if they're odd things, but things to kind of watch for in the short term that we do believe were fairly short term factors for consumer spending, particularly in the first quarter, was the government shutdown. That directly impacted some people in terms of federal government employees, contractors, and probably just created a little bit more broad just uncertainty about what was going on, and that will just about always cause a bit of a pullback in consumer spending, all things equal, and anything to kind of make folks a little bit uneasy. That was one factor. The other one that's been a little bit interesting is the just some folks being surprised about their tax refunds, even in cases where they basically overall paid perhaps lower income taxes due to the changes in the federal tax code. Last year was the first year those hit, so there were adjustments in withdrawals with withholdings. I'm sorry, I should say, and then some changes in the allowances for deductions. So then, in some cases, even though people had paid lower taxes, then when they got lower refunds as they started got ready to file their taxes in February, March, and April, got kind of an unpleasant surprise on that, because some folks do kind of count on that as a bit of a you call it a savings program, that kind of thing. So we see that as something else that maybe just in the short run might have caused a decline in consumer spending, just a little bit of a downside surprise for consumers. But again, we don't really see that as a long-term factor. Federal Reserve, I don't know how much of a change this really was, but certainly the Federal Reserve has probably confirmed that they're not going to be too aggressive on interest rate hikes, that if they don't feel the economy is going to support it. I think maybe there was some concern that they were already kind of locked in on, okay, we're going to do this every 3 or 4 months until we see some real big reason not to. But I think they've signaled more flexibility on that than maybe some folks were expecting. So I think that's been a bit of a change perhaps since December, and those are reflected in our forecast. So really looking at real GDP growth slowing to around that 2% level on average by 2020 and 2021 toward the tail end of the budget of this budget process. Again, this is just kind of a graph we show all the time. I'll just really point out again with the unemployment rate. It's kind of a bit of a feature that we're in an area that we haven't really seen very much over the years. And so, kind of trying to come to terms with exactly what that means in terms of economic growth and in terms of wage growth, potentially triggering inflation. But for now, it hasn't really, doesn't appear to be a big problem. So I've probably already talked about a few of these, especially at the U.S. level in terms of kind of specific items. Certainly things that I've talked about with the committee and the analysts that I work with. Certainly on the U.S. side, things haven't changed very much. One thing that we're seeing a bit of weakness in manufacturing relative to what we had seen in the past. Some of that we see as a bit of a short term. I think certainly one of the big things that manufacturers have been dealing with is some of the tariff issues, both on import tariffs and export tariffs, impacting their availability and price of their inputs and then demand for their products. I think we did see it's kind of looking like there was a good bit of or some kind of pulling forward of manufacturing activity, maybe trying to get ahead of tariffs that were expected to go into play really early this year that ended up at least getting pushed back. So we do feel like manufacturers maybe got a bit ahead of what they normally would have done, which boosted activity last year a little bit, but then also has boosted inventories. So may cause a bit of a slowing in manufacturing. So again, these are just kind of things to watch for. I'm just trying to differentiate between kind of longer term changes in trend versus short term adjustments that won't necessarily persist. Within the state of Indiana, one thing that did impact kind of one of the big bottom line numbers that we look at, which is wage disbursements, the total wage income for workers really in the second quarter of 2018. In December, we were going off an initial estimate of, by the BEA that had already been reported, and then in the interim, they revised that number downward, and that was by 2.3 billion. So that really ends up serving as kind of the jumping off point for the rest of the forecast. We don't view that as kind of a transitory thing that was going to bounce back from that. That was a bit of a shift in the level. Wasn't huge, but it was enough to trigger a couple of conversations between Hari and myself about what happened here, and that does get reflected moving forward. Certainly in Indiana, we talk a lot about manufacturing. Really, Indiana, has really the highest proportion of manufacturing employment of any state, so that still makes it a pretty big factor here. So, any of the trend that we saw at the national level, will impact the state of Indiana. Again, we don't see, really big red flags coming out, but just maybe a little bit of a moderation of activity from what we were expecting. So I'll move forward a bit. Again, this is one we kind of look at all the time, in terms of how employment growth is moving within the state of Indiana versus the United States. I'll, repeating myself here, but it's always worth repeating that part of what influences this, especially in the longer term, and especially as we get into, pretty much of a full employment economy, is that really availability of workers, starts to limit how much employment growth you can expect in certain areas. This is not really unique to the state of Indiana here. Certainly a lot of the northern tier of the United States and the eastern tier simply has lower population growth. We've seen some changes in increases in the labor force participation rate, but there are limits to how much we expect that to grow relative to other parts of the country that are seeing higher population growth. So I just always put that out there, not necessarily is anything that we can do anything about, but just to be aware of how the state is comparing to the rest of the country. And we do see a bit of narrowing up there, but certainly lower overall employment growth is something that we expect to persist due to that. Now wage growth on the other hand, certainly the presence of higher wage industries like manufacturing can help boost wages. At some point, the data, these data are always a little jumpy, and that's part of what influenced that revision in the second quarter. Certainly has done relatively well compared with the United States, partly just due to the state's industry mix. Moving forward, we expect it to come more in line with the national average. And this just kind of overall look at some of the numbers, and one thing I'll point out is really kind of that top line number. And I've talked with a few clients about this, and just that gets raised is that as you go down to really 0% growth in payroll employment. Now that's a little, one little fluky thing going on there with federal employment due to the census in 2020 that comes off in 2021. But, kind of zero growth in employment itself, we don't really see it as recessionary per se, and we see, really employment growth getting very low at the U.S. Again, we're just talking about literal full employment here. So, kind of just want to go over what that number means and what it does not mean as far as I'm concerned. So then we see some pretty decent gains in wage income, but when you have no growth in your overall payrolls, then all that growth in wage income needs to come from higher average wages. So that's just what the forecast is banking on at this point, and certainly we feel reasonable to expect that. Again, real gross state product, very much mirroring what we're seeing at the national level in terms of the relationship between what's going on with the state and with the U.S. Housing starts, we have actually seen probably some relatively good news. We've finally, had just about time we'd given up a little bit on growth in housing starts. We're seeing a little bit of an uptick now, probably because mortgage interest rates have actually gone down a bit recently. Maybe a bit of a help. Maybe some other factors easing up a little bit, but that's certainly one thing that's been a little bit weak in this entire recovery relative to what we otherwise would have expected. Just a little bit of a snapshot of kind of how we've gotten here over the last couple of years. Certainly, healthcare always is a big provider of manufacturing in terms of employment growth, and we do see that continuing. That's largely a demand thing. Certainly with some of the expansion of availability of health insurance. Made that, a little bit more of effective demand, but certainly broader factors, aging of the population, that kind of thing, really increasing demand for those services. Manufacturing has been a strong point, really, as we get into the next couple of years. We don't expect that to continue to be a positive in terms of employment growth. I think still in terms of wage growth, that will be a contributor. Construction has come forward. Information was one that has raised some questions. That's really just kind of some old line industries that have pulled back on their jobs. This is always a big one. I talk about every time I come here, just because of the presence of automotive manufacturing within the state. Just what a big factor it is, and I think especially given that the decline we saw coming out of the recession, then the really big run up that we've seen in this certainly has been very supportive to the state of Indiana. and its economy. So then the question becomes, when does the other shoe drop on this, or, will it? Our forecast for quite some time has been very similar to this, that we expect really a leveling off of vehicle sales. We don't see much chance of continued increases from here, but we see it really hanging in there, and at least being supportive of maintaining a lot of the gains that we've seen over the last few years. And then, but then a big factor really has been the switch over to light trucks and SUVs. Demand for those relative to demand for cars has just been a huge structural shift in that industry. Again, home building, kind of just include kind of a little bit way back history on that to show where things were prior to the recession, which was largely triggered by the housing bust. I think initially coming out of the recession, some of the expectations were to get back to those levels of housing starts, in the 2000s. Probably a little bit questionable whether that was something to aspire to see a repeat on. But I think now, we're seeing where things, are going to go on that. But certainly supportive of, the economic activity, and reflects, partly reflects just, pent-up demand that occurred during the, coming out of the recession, but a little bit disappointing relative to what we were expecting. This something that we always go through, just kind of see how the forecast has changed relative to or relative to where we were a couple of years ago as we started talking about some of these things. Most of the indicators have come in a bit lower than we started out. Well, no, that's not entirely true. In terms of at the U.S. level, been a little bit up and down. One thing I'll point out again is that in the red numbers there is that decline in the growth rate, and that really was triggered entirely by the BEA revision. So just kind of shows where that came from, basically. But certainly, wherever it came from, that's, it's something, to be dealt with from a budgetary standpoint. So kind of just give the bottom line here. As usual, I have some other slides behind this that's more U.S.-based. We can get into those as much or as little as you'd like to, but just kind of summing up the thoughts at the state level. Certainly, manufacturing, transportation has been another sector that's been doing well within the state and across the country. That's partly supported by just overall economic growth. Certainly some of the changes that we've seen in the retail sector in particular have placed some more demands on the transportation sector also, in terms of more direct delivery to homes, really trying to get things to deliver very quickly rather than to more of an orderly distribution process that we tended to expect with most of the retail sales being out of brick and mortar stores. There's been really kind of a structural change for the transportation industry that's given it a boost for now. Certainly, more high-tech sectors. Certainly read every day about new things going on within the state of Indiana, especially kind of centered on the city of Indianapolis. Just a lot going in with software development. A lot of consulting work on just all kind of information technology, Internet of Things. Try not to go on too much about this, but these are all, just really the big opportunities that we see moving forward. There's just a lot of things yet to be kind of automated, digitized, and that kind of thing. And that's, whether that's developing new sensors, new ways of dealing with that data, just all that information that gets generated, just really to stay competitive. Is certainly something that we see as a big driver of growth across the nation, and see good plenty of signs of that happening within the state of Indiana also. So we certainly incorporate those developments in our forecast also. Again, manufacturing, one thing I will say, I've been warned that one thing that may be on people's minds a little bit is possibility of recession. Certainly, manufacturing is a I'll say, having brought that up, I'll say we don't forecast a recession. Probably more risk to the forecast to the downside than to the upside. That's pretty normal, at this stage of, an economic cycle. We can talk about specific risk factors, but certainly one of the things that we look at, in terms of what impact, a national recession would have on specific industries, manufacturing is certainly one that kind of heads the list in terms of things where we would see pullbacks in activity, pullbacks, in durable goods, consumption, especially vehicle sales, that kind of thing would be impacted in the short run. So that's certainly something that we're mindful of. Again, we don't really see that as the most likely scenario. We are, mindful of that as a risk factor, for manufacturing heavy states in general. So I'll point that out. Again, I'll just kind of sum up by saying certainly, labor force issues, longer term issues, and that can be, I think really we're talking more quantity of labor force rather than quality, just gets to be a limiting factor in many states as we move forward, and, that's not something to, sit here and point fingers, about, but just being realistic about, where things might go. Certainly labor force is something that we keep an eye on very much moving forward. I can keep going at this point or certainly entertain questions.
Any questions? Representative Brown?
Thank you. Thank you for the information. What red flag will say Indiana's on the corner of a recession?
Would certainly be manufacturing related, I would think, most likely related to demand for autos, certainly more than we've seen so far. I think especially with things like recreational vehicles is part of this, and that's Indiana has a big presence in that area. Just really anything that would impact kind of more big ticket automotive sales. Rising gasoline prices would be one that would pose a risk. I think a bit of a structural change that we've seen is with the U.S. itself having so much more oil production and potential for oil production. We see that probably as less of a risk than it's been in the past in terms of a spike in gasoline prices causing problems for manufacturing or, for automotive demand. We saw that in, I think it was about 2005, 2006. There was a big gasoline price spike, and it really just destroyed some higher end auto sales for a while. But we don't really see that. But I would think the main thing I would watch for would be some really just bad news on the manufacturing front, especially automotive.
Well, RV companies are already starting to lay off, so should that be our red flag?
No, I think some of it, is really more related to this, kind of leveling off that we've been expecting overall, and so some of that, can be a bit of, related to automation also, but we don't really see that as a red flag at this point.
Representative Porter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Jackson, for being here. On slide number 8, at the bottom, you have, in regards to information, that section number 2 from the bottom. What does that consist of?
That really is a pretty wide range of industries. That can be software publishing and developing, although a lot of that now is falling more under professional and business services. It depends on exactly what you're doing with it. That can be telecommunications, that can be phone companies, cable companies, newspapers.
So basically IT and information like that, right?
Yeah, but it's, it's an interesting combination of industries that are still growing quite a bit versus industries that are really kind of pulling back, such as newspapers, even some of the, wired telecommunications, that kind of thing. So it's a mix of those activities. As I drill down some in the specific job losses within that category, more has been in terms of telecommunications, more of the older line telecommunications, newspaper publishing, book publishing, that kind of thing is really where specifically those job losses came from.
Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Mine are going to be a little more specific. On page 4, you talk at the bottom about and there has been concerns about the lack of housing in the starts, and you talk about possible causes for that. One is a lack of land zone for residential. Is that because it's ag and it can't, land is, or is it the other way, that our cities are not keeping up with zoning commercial, industrial to residential?
It's more of a zoning. It's really a zoning. In many cases, it's seen as a zoning issue that just more difficult to, whether it's rezoning, industrial, uses, more commercial uses for residential. Sometimes it can be specific permitting, particularly if you're looking at putting in big developments. There's a big difference between wanting to build one house somewhere and wanting to put in a high rise or a big complex. I think especially with some of the shift that we've seen to more multifamily development, zoning probably gets to be a little more issue there. Although it's an issue in rural areas also. Even, I'm from a rural area, on the eastern side of the state, and sometimes it's amazing how, somebody wants to put a house basically in the middle of nowhere, and it still gets, can be fought a little bit. So but we see it mostly as more of an urban suburban phenomenon.
And that's what I was kind of concerned about. I mean, we talk about attracting millennials and attracting a labor force, and whether or not that would be in my next question when you talk about the student loan debt, and if they're interested in buying a house versus a condo, or they can't afford to, but also then it impacts whether or not they want to buy a car or need to buy a car if they live in an urban community where there's transportation, et cetera. And so I guess the irony is maybe we haven't all thought to go back to the most fundamental thing. If there's no place to live in the urban communities and we're spending all these redevelopment dollars, then the locals need to get ahead of the game as well and allow these kinds of unique and interesting projects. Maybe not unique everywhere, but certainly to parts of Indiana.
Yeah, it's one of those where everybody wants more housing, but they often want it somewhere else. It's one of those things, yeah.
And so getting back to the student loan debt, when you talk about that being an issue, do you know that people in that age range who have student loan debt would like to buy but can't because of the debt, or they're just not interested? I mean, we know some are carrying significant debt, but... It's
some of both, but I think, the wanting to buy and not being able to is more common. I don't know that, simply not wanting to, own something. And in many cases, but then the other thing is in many cases, they do want to buy, more of a condo deal, not necessarily, a house with, a yard and that kind of thing. But there is definitely more interest in buying than can be accommodated.
Okay, and going back to that slide on the different areas, I think it was 8, following up on Representative Porter, I'm a little concerned with, and I'm going to guess then, I'm hoping that some of the IT is in the professional business services, hopefully, so that we are seeing growth there, because
It is.
I was curious too what the information, but I'm also a little curious. The state and local government is in there, and that's growing. I don't know if that's always a good thing. Do you know where that is exactly? Is it they're replenishing, for example, public safety that they had to lay off or something? And do you know, is that a local or is that a state issue?
I think it's mostly local. Now, one thing to bear in mind, state and local government does include public schools. So that's a big one. Any public school districts, public universities, that gets included in state and local government.
So is that
employment
because
also.
our birth rates are down, and so there are lower, I mean, we know that colleges are going to start looking at lower enrollments because there are fewer students graduating and going on to college, just because the numbers are there. Is that it as well?
You mean in terms of the low growth?
The
Yeah.
public, yes, public school
Yeah,
employment.
yeah, I mean,
Okay.
we still see growth, but yeah, certainly lower than we've seen in the past, and yeah, that is partly just due to demographics, yes.
All right, thank you.
You said local government include schools?
It includes most schools, not all. Some, it gets a little tricky. I mean, certainly any public schools, elementary schools, high schools, it's just the way it's calculated, that counts as local government.
Then what would count under education?
Privately owned education, which can be charter schools, certainly for-profit schools, universities. A few are considered, would be public, would be counted under
Well,
public.
private university would fall under education.
Yes.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, Mr. Reynolds. I can't pronounce it, so.
You good?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, Hari and I are here today to very quickly review the revenue forecast as a update to our December 2018 forecast. This chart would remind the committee of the process that we go through to make our consensus forecast, which includes the 4 fiscal analysts, Dr. Meitzel and Dr. Falk from Ball State and Dr. Meitzel from IU, and then Hari and his team, LSA, and then we select the equations that are fed by the variables from the IHS forecast that we just heard from. As a quick update to where we are right now, performance of the major revenue sources on sales tax against the December 18 forecast, we're right on target, as opposed to last year, we're 3.7% above the same period in fiscal year 18. Individual income, we're 1.7% below forecast, the December 2018 forecast, and we are 2.5% below fiscal year 18. On corporate income tax, we're 10.9% above the forecast, 96.8% above fiscal year 18. And in total general fund revenues, we are 0.1% above the December 18 forecast, and we are 3.8% above fiscal year 18. Quickly mentioning some of the economic forecasts that we just heard about. The U.S. economies exhibit sustained growth. Our unemployment rate has remained at 4%. Although the forecast is weighted with uncertainties, the odds are still against any 2019 recession, and the broader economy could be negatively impacted if consumer spending slows down. As we did in the 2018 forecast, the legislative changes that have occurred prior to this session have been incorporated. That would be like the revenue code update from last year, the sales tax exemption, the ongoing corporate and FIT rate reductions, and the changes that we made to the gasoline use tax distributions. Those have all been incorporated into the forecast. The committee made no changes to the equations that we used in December 18, so this graphic here just is a reminder of the variables that were used in the equations, and once again, that's no change from where we were in 2018. Two other, just as we did in the December 18, there are two major adjustments that we have made to the forecast. One dealing with the U.S. Supreme Court decision on the Wayfair online sales and the expected gaming tax revenue loss due to the South Bend Tribal Casino. So moving right to where everybody wants us to be, and they want me to push the next button. So this is a review of where we are right now, the April 2019 forecast compared to the December 18 forecast. I'll go through each of the components of the income. So for sales tax, the impact, the change from the December 2018 forecast in 2019 would be a reduction of $57.7 million. In 2020, $39.9 million reduction, and in 2021, an increase of 24.4. Individual income, in 2019, we would be reducing the revenue forecast by $79.1 million. In 2020, reducing it by $74.9 million. 2021, reducing it by $88.2 million. Corporate income tax for 2019, the April forecast would add $97.6 million. In 2020, it would add $60.6 million. In 2021, it would add $41.6 million. In the gaming taxes, the April forecast would add $2.6 million in 2019, 2.5 in 2020, 3.3 in 2021. For all other taxes, the forecast would add $35.5 million for 2019, 20.6 for 2020, and 17.9 in 2021. So in total general fund revenues, the April forecast would remove $1 million from 2019, remove $31.2 million from the December forecast in 2020, and remove $1 million from the December forecast for 2021. And with that, Mr. Chairman, Hari and I would be happy to take any questions.
Any questions? Senator Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you go to page 9? Tax revenue for the state of Indiana. We seem to hit a reduction in personal income, pretty significant number, in my opinion, for net income to Hoosier taxpayers. But we had a corresponding, what looks like to be equal increase in corporate income tax. Now, that's coupled with the fact that if you go back to the prior slides, we sped up, or I believe the last 2 fiscal years, we sped up the corporate income tax deduction. Am I correct?
Speed it up.
Well, it's still been going down, right? So if I were to take all three of those factors in place, it says to me that corporate income has gone up significantly. If you have a reduction in the rate, you see an increase in the amount. It's gone up a lot. But personal income, individuals, has gone down. Am I correct?
Senator, there are a few dynamics going on here. On the individual income tax front, it's a combination of the following things. One, wage disbursements, wages and salaries, like Tom Jackson mentioned, was revised downwards, wages and salaries for Indiana. So that brought this forecast down for all the years.
Forecast to go down?
If you see the $79 million in 2019, minus 74 in 2020, minus 88 in 2021, that is partly driven by the forecast for wage disbursements in Indiana being lower than in December.
Does that mean people are making less money?
The growth is less than they estimate in December.
Okay, so
Secondly,
just let me, because I get complicated. Personal income growth is forecast to go down.
the growth.
Okay,
Yes.
all right, go ahead.
Secondly, last year, there was kind of a timing situation related to non-residents withholdings from partnerships. So that kind of affects those numbers as well.
What was it? Foreign?
Partnerships, non-residents withholding. So if you're a partnership and you withhold for your non-resident shareholders, that money first is into corporates, but then is transferred to individual. And we've changed the timing of that in the processing, so that is also factored into the numbers where it's lower. As to what's affecting corporate is impacted by overall the corporate profits as well as the industrial activity. In our model, we have a variable that's actually capturing industrial production in transportation equipment, which in our view kind of captures what Indiana is most sensitive to. And on those two variables of corporate profits and industrial production and transportation equipment, the corporate profits is expected to really grow faster than expected in December. And then lastly, for corporate, that also benefits from what I just told you about the non-resident partnership withholding, just the timing issue. And then lastly, part of what's affecting corporate as well is the refunds forecast is tamed down compared to 2018.
Refunds.
If you remember, in 2018, corporate refunds spiked, which kind of led to us lowering that forecast. Well, refunds this year to date, are about $30 million lower, I believe. So that is also taken into adjustments here.
Okay, I'm not a economist, so I'm going to try to break this down to its most basic element. In 2000, I believe it was back in 2016, we as a legislature decided to lower the corporate income tax rate. Am I correct? Phase it in. Phase 13. Okay. Well, we decided as a public policy we'd lower that rate. The goal, the objective, was twofold from what I remember. One was to lower the unemployment rate. Second, there should have been a corresponding increase in wages according to what we felt the corporate structure would do. What it seems to me has happened is corporate profits have spiked and wages for the average Hoosier has either gone down or we're predicting that they're going to go down, right?
So on the corporate front, you're right that corporate profits is higher than originally estimated.
Okay.
On the individual income tax front, it is important to clarify that the growth is accelerating from the prior year. So between 2012 and 2017, employment.
Oh, I see, the 79 to 74.
It's just a difference between the growth. Essentially, instead of growing by 4.5%, it's growing by, let's say, 4%.
Okay, what about the difference, then why is your, so the growth, the amount in 2020 to 21, though, is another reduction, am I correct?
Right, because that growth rate is just revised downward for all the years. So if 2019 is lower, that makes the 2020 number lower and the 2021 number lower as well.
But that's not, okay,
So,
all right.
so basically, if
The 2021 number is 88 million, which is higher.
sorry, could you repeat that?
I don't know if I'm looking at the right thing here, but it looks like the 2021 number is 88 million,
Yes.
which is higher than 74.
Yes.
So you're predicting a growth in individual income between 19 and 20, yet a downward shift 20 to 21, am I correct?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
And part of that is because the growth rate is kind of decelerating, if you will. Instead of, it goes from 3.6% in 2020 to
Right.
3.3.
So
that's-
wages, instead of going up, could go down.
That's right.
All right, thank you.
No, I'm answering more questions. Do you have a question? Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hari or David, quick question. Since 2013, has Indiana personal wages grown year over year?
The growth, I believe, in state taxable income from 2011 has been about 3.7%.
So since 2011, Hoosier wages have grown about 3.7% per year up to, and we're going to continue to see growth going into those out years. This forecast just adjusts the growth downward slightly, but still shows growth. So from 2011 to 2021, we're going to continue to see Hoosier wages grow each year.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Senator Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And yes, to follow up on that, the idea is we, particularly coming out of the recession, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, particularly because we're a manufacturing state and rely so heavily, we got hit hard, but we really jumped ahead, so to speak, percentage-wise, because we recovered, and we filled those jobs up. But is it fair to say now that perhaps we have sort of tapped out because we know we have a need for jobs and we just don't have the bodies to fill them? And so if this is not losing money, this is the fact we're not increasing the jobs, so not increasing the individual income tax as much as we'd like, as much as we'd hope, because we can't fill the jobs we have because we don't have the bodies. And we don't know if it's because we don't have the bodies or we haven't skilled them up to the job that's available. Is that also?
Yes.
Okay.
Essentially, we are seeing an increase in wages and salaries. Now, it's just not as much as we estimated in December. And overall, it is kind of what Tom Jackson was saying in his presentation. It is kind of related to the industry composition in Indiana. And that's something that's seeing U.S.-wide with the manufacturing sector. And so Indiana's kind of impacted by that as well, because a lot of the jobs, you know, in terms of the share of total employment in Indiana, manufacturing is really high. I believe it's the highest across all states. So that's affecting that as well.
Right, and so in fact, in Mr. Jackson's slide, our higher productivity and employer competition have bolstered higher wages by that slide. Now it's not going as significantly increasing year to year, right? So it's sort of slowing down the growth. We still have growth just because perhaps we just can't fill those high wage jobs that are out there.
That's right.
All right, thank you.
Senator Taylor?
All right, going to that same model that you had in regards to anticipated wage growth, can you go to that slide in the the Indiana forecast update?
You want me-
Well, here, let me go to it, because I want to make sure I heard what you said in answering Senator Brown's question. The wage rates, according to the forecast, shows an uptick. So if the wage, and this is just a question, if the wage growth shows an uptick, then how does our forecast have a negative balance, have a negative effect on our income?
So the growth currently, this April forecast sees a $216 million, $141 million growth in individual income from 2019 to 2018.
And where's that at? Where were you?
On slide 9,
Okay. Thank you.
the
Go ahead.
growth is 141, in 2020 is 216, and 2021 is 205. So overall, the forecast has been revised down for 2019. It used to be about
Okay.
6,037,000,000 instead. Now it's 5,957,000,000, which is why it's
So the negative that I see in the difference is the difference between your December and your April forecast. Now, that is all right. That is good to know, because if we go back to the 2018 forecast, you're saying that because of what Senator Brown was saying, these jobs are going to be filled. You forecasted the revenue to go down for what we see in 2021, while wages still increase at the 3.7%, as Budget Director Dudas indicated.
it will not go up as much as December. So
Okay.
in December,
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I get it right.
the increase is lower, but it's still increasing.
Okay. So this is a forecast only, and the difference between those two forecasts, this is not the net loss. Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we'll have the Medicaid forecast, Dr. Walthall.
Slides for you.
What's that?
I'll run the slides for you.
Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you for having us this morning. We will be presenting the updated Medicaid forecast for April 2019. I'm Jennifer Walthall, Secretary of the Indiana Family and Social Services Administration.
Good morning. My name is Robert Damler. I'm a principal and consulting actuary with Milliman, and I'm a member of the American Academy of Actuaries. So this morning we will be presenting the Medicaid forecast, and we're going to start on slide 2. So we previously had presented a Medicaid forecast in December, and that Medicaid forecast included data and information through September 30th. So as more data and information becomes available, we do update our forecast. So this forecast is representative of data through January 31st of 2019. So that includes both enrollment, the number of beneficiaries that are enrolled in the programs, as well as the paid expenditures that have occurred through January 31st, 2019. Following collection of the data through the end of January, we also look at prior period adjustments. So we go through and there are adjustments to the program for claims completion, enrollment, historical data of things that have occurred, and so those are reflected throughout our Medicaid forecast. Once we collect all of the historical data as well as changes in the historical data, we create a baseline forecast, and that baseline forecast is for the next biennium, which is fiscal years 20 and 21, beginning on July 1st, 2019. We project both the enrollment growth by all of the different populations, Hoosier Healthwise, Healthy Indiana Plan, Hoosier Care Connect, all of our eligible beneficiaries for the program, as well as projecting health cost trends. Our primary health cost trends are mostly utilization trends because we do control a lot of our healthcare costs, although some of them are statutorily changing or changing just because of the industry, which is primarily the pharmacy. Pharmacy healthcare costs do grow over time, which we are projecting, which would reflect new drugs as well coming into the pharmacy pipeline. And then finally, we have a projection of approved future program changes that will occur over the next biennium. So that has established our current Medicaid forecast. The next several pages of our slide, we're actually going to skip over at this time. We can return for any questions that you may have, but I'm going to jump to slide 6. And on slide 6, what we have prepared for you is a reconciliation of the changes to our December forecast. So again, we presented information to you in December of this year on a Medicaid forecast, and this is a reconciliation for our appropriation need, the state share. We are showing 3 fiscal years, the completion of fiscal year 19, and then the 2 years within our biennium. So the values that are shown on the top line were presented in our December forecast, starting at $2.2 billion in 2019 and just under $2.5 billion in 2020 and just under $2.6 billion in 2021. Again, these are the state share of our forecasts. This would also rely on federal and other funds helping to pay for the Medicaid services. So the first item of reconciliation would be with regard to our long-term services and supports. This is the program that provides care for individuals that have needs to either be institutionalized in facilities, whether they're nursing homes or other types of facilities, or individuals that are receiving home and community-based waiver services. So they're being served in the community, potentially in a home or a group home, but receive a higher level of care due to their health care needs. We are seeing continued growth in that program, in those programs, and so we have adjusted our projected financial need to being an additional $2 million in 2019, $19 million, and then $27 million in each of the next 2 years. The second line item indicates the Part D clawback. And back in 2006, when the federal government created the Medicare Part D program, they created a program where states that were previously paying their share of cost for dual eligible beneficiaries for prescription drugs, they will now make a payment between the state program to the federal government program to help offset the cost of the Medicare Part D program. So these are state-only values, and we have updated our values to reflect more current payment information associated with the dual eligible. So we, the state, make a payment, and that payment is approximately $100 per person per month for anyone who is enrolled in both Medicare and Medicaid. That is a state-only dollar amount, and that dollar amount, again, is paid from the state government to the federal government for all those that have Medicare Part D and enrolled in Medicaid. So you can see a higher appropriation need, not only in state fiscal year 19, but also in 20 and 21. The next two items are payment timing issues. We had expected to be making payments for the health insurer fee in 2019, as well as some capitation rate updates to our managed care plans in 2019. However, those payments are being delayed into 2020. So this is just the payment timing differential. Our Medicaid forecasts are shown on a paid basis or cash basis, and so that both those are timing payment differentials. The next line item relates to pharmacy rebates. And again, pharmacy rebates are recoveries, so that's why they are shown as negative amounts. And we have adjusted the amount of pharmacy rebates that we believe that we'll collect not only in this year, but over the next 2 years as well. Those generally relate to a percentage of our pharmacy spend. And just for your information, we receive about 50 to 60% of what we spend on pharmacy back in rebates. So if we spend $100 million out to the pharmaceutical companies, as an example, or to the pharmacists through the dispensing of drugs, we'll receive back about half of that, $50 to $60 million, as an example, in pharmacy rebates. So we've just adjusted the amount of rebates that we are receiving. Those do grow generally on an annual basis. There are some policy and program changes that Secretary Walthall will discuss on the next slide, and then other changes in our forecast. These are minor adjustments that do occur. So you can see in state fiscal year 2019, the variance is a decrease in budget need of $40 million, and in 2020 and 2021, a budget increase need of approximately $52 million. So that would reconcile the December forecast to the April forecast.
If you turn to the next slide, slide 7, I'm going to walk you through some of our programs that are important for updating Medicaid services for Hoosiers and that have become high priority for the agency. The first line is the durable medical equipment methodology change. We are moving to the Medicare methodology change, which allows for standardization across Medicare and Medicaid on how we allow for durable medical equipment to be reimbursed. This methodology change, in general, is a decrease in cost for us. The one variance is the way that Medicare covers vision services, thus a slight increase in cost to Indiana Medicaid. The next line is budget neutral for across the entire program, but we are increasing the administration fee for the Vaccines for Children program. Prevention and vaccinations are incredibly important for Indiana, and that administration fee has not been increased in quite some time. So to encourage providers to continue to use the VFC fund primarily for vaccines instead of Indiana Medicaid, we've increased the administration fee to encourage using that fund of money over Medicaid for administration of vaccinations. This has been in a great partnership with providers and with the Indiana State Department of Health for increasing vaccination rates across all of Indiana. The next line is that we are phasing out the Healthy Indiana Plan Enhanced MRO or Medicaid Rehabilitation Option reimbursement. When we had the initial Healthy Indiana Plan approved, the MRO enhanced reimbursement was not approved by CMS. However, because it had initially been built into the Healthy Indiana Plan, we continued to pay that enhanced fee for MRO. That program is now stabilized, and as HIP reaches maturity, we are going back to regular Medicaid rates for the MRO reimbursement with a savings, as you see, of $4.8 million in 20 and $5.2 million in 21. The next line is a new program within Medicaid. We are working currently with the federal government on something that we are calling the HIP Bridge program. The HIP Bridge program is a process by which we can support individuals who are part of the Gateway to Work program and receive gainful new employment, and they become over eligibility for the Healthy Indiana Plan. We are working on different mechanisms excuse me, to support their transition into other coverage forms of Medicaid. We know that Hoosiers have many things that happen in their lives, and going from one coverage plan to another without a safety net in place can be more challenging than individuals might be able to do on their own. We're very excited about working with the federal government on this first of its kind plan to help end or at least mitigate the cliff effect that we see as Medicaid programs and new insurance coverage types begin. The next line is also built as a budget neutral program, but we are asking to increase our aged and disabled waiver slots. What we believe that this will do is help individuals access home and community-based services primarily before institutional settings for their aging and in-home services care. And so by increasing waiver slots, we will help to divert those new members into home-based services rather than their more expensive counterparts in institutional services. Additionally, there is a waiver level of service tool that will help calculate how those needs and level of services occur so that we can adjust our rate methodology based on need for aged and disabled services. And finally, on the last line, we have, as you know, changed the method by which we provide non-emergency medical transportation to our traditional Medicaid members as of last June. And because of the way that this service is now run through a brokered model, we have seen more than double the need or availability for this service for our traditional Medicaid members. And as we've been working with our partners both in the transportation provider industry, the healthcare delivery system, and also our facilities that have very vulnerable patients that need transportation to healthcare appointments, we found that the need for increasing that transportation reimbursement rate will be incredibly helpful for us to continue to grow the network to provide this service for our Medicaid members. And so we are beginning a phased process, and we'd like to start with wheelchair providers. We have not increased, we increased wheelchair rates when we began this service in a targeted manner, but this will help us increase wheelchair provider reimbursement rates across the state so that we can enhance the network in that specific vulnerable population. That is with a total of 1.2 million projected increase in 20 and 2.3 million in 21. So the forecasted appropriation need after incorporating those changes, as you saw from the previous slide, is there. So 2.5 billion in 20 and 2.6 billion in 21.
So we're available for any questions.
Is there time?
Thank you. Can you look at slide 7? I'm sorry, 6. 6. Yeah. So on the bottom line there, where you've got the $40 million that you don't, that is sort of like a credit that you don't expect to spend, is that, can we assume, in my mind, I can assume that we shift that over to the next year and then you only need $12 million more. Can I assume that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Talian, that would be part of that final budget discussion. So this is the information we need to discuss with the potential surplus in Medicaid, there's been different ways we've handled that in the past, and so specifically with regard to the 41.2 million, I would want to make sure that we're not taking out of the appropriation and adding. I'd rather just carry it over within the Medicaid fund and allow those surplus dollars specific to those two items to be available in 2020 so they can spend those dollars versus reverting it and then adding back to the appropriation. But that'll be discussed as we go through the remainder of the session.
Okay, so what I'm getting from this is that on page 6, you're needing an extra 100. We've got 40 sitting there. And then on page 7, you're just about flat.
That's
between
correct.
the 2 years?
Yes.
Okay. And I just, for my own curiosity, what is it that explains the difference between December and now? I mean, what were the factors that changed?
Absolutely. So I'll try to kind of condense it down just a little bit. So first, we have an additional quarter of data that's why we present again in April. That additional quarter of data, if you look on slide 6, the vast majority came from growth in long-term services and supports in that population. As you know, we are about to hit the explosion of our aging population, and so we know that will continue to grow over the next several years, and we're starting to see that growth in enrollment as well. We've seen on the good side of that, we've seen a year-over-year increase in individuals in these programs that are accessing home and community-based services. And kind of going between those two options, that is the lesser of the expense. But we have not seen a concurrent decrease in the populations in this group that are utilizing nursing home or facility-based care. So we've had an overall growth in the total program, which is what you're seeing reflected in those numbers. Absolutely. So the way that we build many of our new programs and are required actually at the federal level is to build them in a budget neutral way so that we're using funding from one and moving it into another space. And so this waiver slot increase assumes that those new individuals that are going into aged and disabled waivers will not be utilizing other services. And so we shift that funding into the home and community-based services setting.
Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, I'm going to go back to slide 5, the Hep C. Those numbers are astronomical, from 1,200 to 9,000. So who are they? How are we tracking them? I mean, are these people who are already participating in our needle exchanges? Are they in treatment as well? I assume some of them, or if not many of them, are addicts as well.
Senator Brown, thank you so much for asking about hepatitis C. We have made some extraordinary progress in Indiana, and this is reflective of our commitment to treating individuals with hepatitis C in a prevention model rather than waiting until there is liver failure, transplantation, chronic hepatitis C, and all of its associated medical costs. We are in our second year of a national program called the Hepatitis C Affinity Group, working on best practices across states, and really are leading the way in this work. This particular commitment as a line item in our budget reflects a population need for hepatitis C treatment. We have an ECHO program. It's a training model for healthcare providers to learn that are not infectious disease doctors, not hepatologists, to treat hepatitis C in primary care settings. And so because of that ECHO enrollment, we're starting to understand more about the landscape of where hepatitis C is across the state and have used that information to project our treatment needs for the coming biennium.
Okay, but you didn't answer my question. Are these people that we know are addicts or are participating in our needle exchange programs?
We don't collect that type of data from our syringe services programs. It's a voluntary and anonymous participation.
But do you collect it from the Hep C patient?
Absolutely.
So do we know if any of the Hep C patients who are receiving treatment have participated in our needle exchange
I'm sorry,
programs?
I misunderstood your question. So the other way around. Yes. So we know whether individuals with hepatitis C have concurrent active substance use disorder.
Okay, well, I would like to know the numbers of that, because I have to say, I guess maybe the success is we're treating them, but I don't know if it's a success because these numbers have ballooned. And so I don't know if we've now just identified,
Yes.
I don't know,
So the
8,000 more people we didn't know 2 years ago who were infected, or probably more to the point, they're now infected. And so why is that? 'Cause
So Senator
that's
Brown,
an
this is not a
epidemic.
ballooning number. This is an existing number of individuals who have not been able to access treatment in the past.
All right, thank you. And then with respect to the transportation, it's not, relatively speaking to the rest of your budget, very significant increase on the transportation. But I am a little concerned because when this first rolled out, as you know, that had a lot of problems with it, a lot of problems with the third-party provider, that administrator that you've contracted with. And I think most of those have been worked out. But the original point was that you found some savings because of some unapproved trips, et cetera. So I think there was about a $2 million savings essentially. But now it's ballooning, relatively speaking. And so I guess my concern is you realize now that those very specific needs, vehicles that can take wheelchairs, they need increased rates. I can understand that. But who is guaranteeing that those rates are being passed on? I think we've seen this before. I'm thinking, since we just had a discussion yesterday about PBMs, is the third-party administrator using actually guaranteeing those rates are being passed on to the providers?
These are direct rates to providers.
Okay, all right. And then my last question, with respect to the increase, again, significant in the LTSS, and it's including in-home, I understand we're hitting, and some of us here in this committee may be close to that, hitting that age where the population may be needing long-term or in-home services, but that's a big increase. And so are we now just identifying and have been very successful of explaining to our older citizens who need care that it's available? Because that's a significant increase. That can't be just explained by population numbers from one year to the next.
So what we're having here is, on this program, is we have identified our payments. So the Part D payments are paid based on data and information we receive from CMS and matching those data files with our eligibility files as well. And we have identified over the last 12 months that there have been some changes in the eligibility determination. And so there have been some reconciliation changes that have been occurring. And so that's where our projections have been changing to reflect a better alignment to a reconciliation with the federal files that we've been receiving.
So the feds have decided more people are eligible that we weren't aware of, and so now we're going to reimburse for more in-home services.
Oh, I'm sorry, it was the Part D. Okay, on the LTSS growth, I'm sorry, I was reflecting the Part D
Right, the other one's
growth.
actually going down. This one's going up significantly.
Yeah, so the LTSS growth is primarily enrollment, and while $19 million is a relatively large number with regard to the budget, these are small changes. These individuals, small changes in our projected growth, small movements of about 0.5% to 1% change in our projected growth. But these individuals do cost, between $2,000 and $5,000 per month. So the number of lives that we're seeing that are staying in the home and community-based setting, as well as staying in the institutional setting, has continued to grow at a slightly faster rate than what we were projecting back in December.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to page 7 to talk about the A&D waiver slots increase. First of all, I think that's a plaudable. That's a plaudable. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
But one of the things that I see is that you're losing providers. The number of providers that you have that are eligible are decreasing. And when I see waiver slots going up, how do you plan to get more providers to provide these services. There's a concern that I have that when you increase the A&D waiver slots, that you're going to have to, over time, you're going to fill those up. But what are the, first of all, I thought there should have been savings there, but I get what you're doing. What are you doing to increase, is there anything in there for increasing the rate for provider agencies?
Senator Taylor, thank you for asking about that. When we talk about providers, you could fill in the blank for a multitude of providers who need to have rates adjusted. There are lots of mechanisms by which we recruit providers into the Medicaid family.
Okay.
One is we try to make it as easy as possible to be part of that system, and so the program enhancements that we have to sign up, we're working on making credentialing easier, making sure that our communication is robust and that training is available. So that's kind of part one. Part two is always supplementing that with market-ready rates, which is hard to do, as you know, in Medicaid. We don't compete with other markets the same as others. However, we are really moving into a process by which we can be more equitable and more reasoned in the way that we approach rates than we have been in the past, so that we are really doing a careful analysis of each provider type over a really systematic period of time for the future. So not just for these types of providers, but for all of the providers that look at Medicaid, so that everyone knows that they're going to have a rate adjustment over a period of time.
Well, I would imagine the A&D waiver would be a point of emphasis. We've seen an increase in both the nursing home community as well as the A&D waiver community. So I think we need to focus on that tremendously. So I'd like to.
So we do have an
I hope that in the future we increase the rates so that we have provider agencies who can provide these services. I'm just going to leave that up to you. But let me talk about the transportation reimbursement increase. I'm still concerned with the fact that there was a decision made in June of last year without oversight from a lot of people that indicated we were going to save money. And I can tell you from a constituent standpoint, there was a lot of my constituents that called my office talking about they weren't getting picked up for services. And then we found out that all there was placed an administrator in the middle of the relationship between the transportation provider and the client. Now and then that administrator is now, correct me if I'm wrong, responsible. You have a contract with the administrator has a contract with the providers that provide the transportation services, and there was a corresponding decrease in the rates that they were going to pay that's what the provider agencies are telling me. The question I have for you is, this waiver level of service increase going directly, I think you said it, is it going directly to the provider agencies, or is it going through the administrator?
So I'll break that down and answer. I think you had a series of questions there. No,
Yes.
That's absolutely fine. Thank you, Senator Taylor. First of all, just going back to your original, there is a home and community-based services rate methodology study that's ongoing.
Good.
So just want to let you know about that. And second, the transportation system change that started in June of last year was not specifically built for fiscal savings. It was to take the program that we have and make it more available to everyone who's in that program, rather than the very few individuals who were utilizing it in the past, without the oversight, so that we'd know that people were getting the services that they needed for the things that Medicaid covers. So that was the primary incentive, not a cost savings, but to really make this program more efficient, more equitable, and honestly more available for more people. Now, is it completely fixed? Absolutely not. I would never sit before you and declare that today. However, we have been able, because of this model, we've been able to see where services are needed so that we can grow them in a targeted manner. We have been able to change provider, I guess behavior is maybe not the right word, but provider behavior to make sure that they're taking people to their medical appointments and pharmacy appointments in the right way and reimbursing those more effectively. These provider rate changes are, again, directly to providers. So that's not the contract to our broker. That's for paying providers directly. Also, I wanted to clarify that we did not decrease rates with this program. Those rates to providers have not been changed. They are the same rates that Medicaid has paid pre and post.
Can you answer this question then?
Yes, sir.
I agree that you didn't decrease the rates that you paid to the provider agency, but just by changing the model and not increasing the amount that went to the new administrator, did you pay I guess my question, maybe I was told wrong, but from what I understand, you didn't increase the rate to the providers, right? But you put an administrator and a broker in the position to manage all of the providers.
And
so they had to take an amount for their administrative costs, and then the remainder went to the provider. That's where I was told it happened.
Our broker accepted the Medicaid pay fee schedule, and it was unchanged.
Right. But that was from you to the, maybe I'm not explaining.
They receive a brokerage fee, but the fee to the provider is unchanged.
So it did cost more to put this broker in place then to Medicaid.
There's a contract with the broker.
Right, but it
Correct.
increased the cost.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Representative Porter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Walthoff, for being here. I want to circle back to slide number 5, looking at it from a public health perspective in regards to the testing of the members, but particularly the treatment. So Sovaldi and Harvandi, how much were they costing 2 or 3 years ago versus the cost now? I know it came up as an issue with Senator Brown, but I just want to look at it from what it was then versus where we are right now. And the 60%, which is a return, in regards to that 48,000. So could you kind of unpack that with us right now, please?
So we've seen a year-over-year decrease in the cost of hepatitis C, and I'll put it in quotes, cure drugs. And so those medications, as they permeate the market, have become less expensive over time as compared to when they entered the market about 5 years ago. And then we also made a program change in 2016 so that Indiana Medicaid manages hepatitis C drugs internally within our pharmacy benefit manager, which means that we receive the rebates back, that 60% rebate directly back to Indiana Medicaid.
So that's the Hep C, the cost in Medicaid savings is a lot better, more now, or what?
Correct. When Sovaldi first came to market as one of the first drugs as a hepatitis C curable drug, that cost was approximately $80,000 per patient for treatment. There were additional drugs that came out that were closer to $100,000. So the initial 2 or 3 drugs that came to market were in that $80,000 to $100,000 market price prior to the rebates that are being shown here today. So now there are more drugs that are on the marketplace, and those drugs do have a much lower average cost. Some individuals will have higher cost drugs and others will have lower cost drugs, so there is a range. And now we're seeing that the cost is roughly $48,000 per patient being treated. And then 60% of that will come back. It does take approximately 6 to 9 months to receive that payment back. So that is impacting our budget slightly in that we'll be paying out $48,000 in one fiscal year, but due to the delay in the rebates, it actually rolls over into the next fiscal year by the time we receive the money back.
And that rebate is about $28,000,
Yes,
28.8,
yes, about 60% of the 48,000.
right? So
So the net cost will be about $20,000 per person,
did that cost be how much?
about $20,000 per person.
Not 48. Okay, thank you very much. Just
Any other questions? Senator Italian?
Thank you. Just one follow-up question. It's recently come to our attention that a couple of states have had their work requirements overturned. How do you think that that's going to affect Indiana?
Thank you, Senator Italian, for that question. As you know, the Gateway to Work program within the Healthy Indiana Plan is live. It started in January of this year. We do not have any reporting requirements until July 1st of this year, so we're in the training phase where our members are receiving notices of their status. They're learning how to engage with their managed care entities about opportunities for education, volunteer, employment, and we're tracking those on a weekly basis on logging into their accounts, and we have had some extraordinary engagement. I have stories to tell that will make you smile on how the program is going in its training phase. And then in July, we begin reporting requirements, but those will phase in. They start with 5 hours, and then they ramp up over a long period of time. The first time we will look at individuals to see how they're doing is at redetermination in January. And so but we're watching very closely right now to make sure that the program is going well. We take feedback on a daily basis on adjustments that we need to make to meet member needs. So we have a very different program than the two that you're referencing, the program in Kentucky and the program in Arkansas. Those programs, one, in my humble opinion, went live a little early. We've taken the entirety of 2018 to build this program and then are doing a very cautious, thoughtful, and thorough phase-in for our members so that they reap all the benefits of this program and don't have their healthcare coverage at risk because of Gateway to Work, but instead, on the contradistinction to that, really are gaining some things that they might not have had access to before. So the end of your question is there any effect on Indiana Gateway to Work? The answer is no. We're continuing to move forward with the program as designed, taking your feedback and constituent feedback as we move forward. Thank you.
Representative Hamilton?
Vaccination rates. I saw you're increasing the reimbursement a little bit to try to get rates up. Thank you. Can you just speak to, in light of like the measles outbreaks in other states, can you speak just briefly to our current rates and how we're doing?
Absolutely. So I'll leave it to Dr. Box to talk about in depth, kind of diving into how we're doing in Indiana on vaccinations. The end of the story is that we are continuously, over the last 5 years, making improvements in where we track in our vaccinations, and kudos to the health department for leading that charge in getting into places so that our kids and families are protected. Currently, you can see the work that they are doing with the hepatitis A outbreak, making sure that individuals in high-risk settings are immunized against hepatitis A as well. So we're making some significant improvements in that really imperative public health initiative, and Indiana Medicaid wants to come alongside that work to make sure that we are incentivizing providers to continue to work with the federal Vaccines for Children program to get those vaccinations out and in kids.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we adjourn, I just want to mention that this will be Jason Dudich's last budget meeting. He will be moving on to be the CFO at UIndy, and it's been a pleasure to work with you, and we're definitely going to miss you and wish you the best.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will truly miss allowing Senator Taylor to get caught up on some things we're talking about. So maybe I'll come back in the future and and hold up some big signs that say, ask this, or here it is. But no, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the members of the committee that I've gotten to work with over the last 2.5 years. Thank you for your support and your collaboration in putting not only one but two budgets together. I'm going to miss the organization and miss the office, and a big thank you to the governor for giving me the opportunity. But again, thank you for the recognition and being able to serve on this committee. I appreciate it.
With that, we will adjourn.